sharing some of your time with us today. I hope you'll feel enriched rather than depleted in a few hours hence. I'm confident that you will, but I just wanted to extend that hope to you. So, my name is Stuart Taylor. I'm a London-based artist, researcher, and writer, and I've been associated with Black Southwest Network since just before the lockdown happened, in the context of looking for partners in Bristol with a group of colleagues that I work with in the psychotherapeutic space, who in 2018 had hosted a conference here called Colonialism and Its Aftermath, which was an international conference that happened at MSHED. Then in the end of 2019 into 2020, lockdown happened, so our dialogue quietens down a little. And then in 2021, it picked up again with the advent of the work that BSWN was doing into what I would refer to as decolonial inquiry or decolonial activism in the arts, culture and heritage sector. And in that process, I became a member of a working group exploring what an UnMuseum might be. We'll come back to that a little later, but I just wanted to offer you that introduction. So on my left are my colleagues Arathi, Michael and Orsod. So I would please encourage you to just offer something of an introduction about your work and your orientation, and then I'll say a little bit more about what we're going to look to explore this evening.
Great, thank you, Stuart. So my name is Arathi Sriprakash. I'm based at the University of Bristol at the School of Education. I'm a sociologist, and much of my work to date has been focused on the relationship between epistemic justice, that is justice surrounding knowledge, and racial justice. So questions about decolonising the curriculum, decolonising knowledge, and indeed decolonising our education system have been central to what I've been doing. So it's lovely to be here today in dialogue with lots of creative and inspiring minds.
Great, my name's Michael Jenkins. I'm a writer, director, filmmaker, co-founder of Blak Wave Productions and Beyond We, a cultural space that we're trying to create in Bristol. Yeah, I mean, my storytelling started off through poetry and through music, and now the medium I choose to sort of tell stories through is through film. Yeah, that's a bit about me. Obviously, my sort of orientation of when it comes to stories is I'm really interested in telling untold and unheard stories. That's sort of what I've always been interested in, and of course, I love history, studying history, and all things around history. I'm really interested in that. So yeah, that's just a little bit about me.
Hi everyone. I'm Orsod Malik. I am a curator by profession. I'm the program curator at the Stuart Hall Foundation, and I'm also a curator at the International Curators Forum. And I suppose my relationship to storytelling is one, that involves multiple, practices. I'm really interested in archival work and the philosophy of archiving. I'm really interested in the philosophy of curatorial work as well, and thinking about how to curate history specifically, and anti-colonial histories. And really my focus is thinking about the relationship between power and storytelling. So, which stories are centralized, and where are the gaps and silences that we can kind of ply open to find stories that kind of maybe complicate or disrupt kind of the stories that we're often told since primary school, or whatever our curriculum kind of is orientated to, kind of mainly Eurocentric histories, and trying to think about what the relationship to anti-colonial histories are to centralized mainstream history. And yeah, that's a bit about me.
So thank you, Arathi, Michael, Orsod. Although we're not literally sat in a circle, the ethos that we would like you to adopt, if you will, is that we are sat in a circle. So there's two things I'd like to say about that. The first of them, the obvious thing, is that there are no corners in a circle, so everybody can see everybody and everybody is equal. It's a horizontal arrangement, spatially and relationally. And the second thing is that we are individuals with existing practices, and we have orientations, and we have perspectives to bring to bear, but we're definitely not, in inverted commas, the experts. So we really encourage and invite your participation, your engagement, your challenge, your critique of anything that you hear that you feel so moved to respond to. I guess I would say that if you are so moved to respond to something you've heard, or as importantly, not heard, that you think ought to be voiced, ought to be surfaced, please raise your hand and we'll ensure that you have a mic so that your question or questions can be heard, and we'll try to weave your contribution into the flow of the evening. So that said, does anybody have a question at this point, or anything they'd like to say, or should we just dive in?
Let's take a deep dive, man.
So on that note, I'll just say one other very brief thing, which is we've got this loose framing device for our time together in the context of story. Three elements that we're working with: story as light, story as glue, and story as web. So in thinking about light, it illuminates what's present. So maybe, given we've had this brief introduction, Michael, you might want to say a little bit more about your story. How come you got to be here this evening in terms of your origin, your background, and the key inspirations along the way to this point?
Oh, that's a big question. Geez, where do I start? So I suppose I started, I guess when it comes to stories and consuming stories, in my household there was a lot of music being played, a lot of roots reggae music being played, and for my dad's side, and then for my mum's side it was more like the soul, R&B sort of stuff here in America. That's probably where I started hearing stories first, and the Bible as well, because I was brought up in a Catholic household. Well, actually it wasn't Catholic, it was a mixture. It was like, my mum was Catholic, but my dad was like a martial arts teacher, so he used to teach Jeet Kune Do, so he used to always teach me the way basically, which I found out as I got older. There's another sort of spiritual system around Taoism and around the Tao and yin yang and things like that. So I've had an eclectic sort of upbringing when it comes to that sort of thing. But when I first started telling my own stories, it was through poetry, through music. I think I wrote my first poem when I was like 10. And then from there, I sort of discovered hip hop and started writing songs and things like that. So that was like my first journey, and that was really just talking about, those sort of times I was just talking about my friends, my environment. It was a lot of bravado within that sort of storytelling. But it was really telling a story about where I was from and what we were up to, and the lack of things for us to do. So that was sort of my introduction to putting out stories. Then eventually, like as life goes, I didn't go to university or anything. I sort of dropped out of college, was working in a kebab house, and just thought like my child was born, so I thought I need to sort of do something. So I went to the Prince's Trust and got went on their scheme, like their business scheme, and got some help to sort of start my first production company, which was essentially just me making shorts for all different organisations, and working with Seda like a good 10 years ago, probably a bit more, on sort of some of her first initial projects. that's when I was learning about, you know, the amount of stories that are around us, like, you know. Growing up, obviously, I hated the media. I really despised it because I could acutely see that it was responsible. I felt it was responsible for some of the racism I was receiving because of some of the racist images that were on the TV. So I didn't really, and the sort of stereotypical views that were on the TV. So I didn't really grow up with a love of the media. But eventually I stopped moaning and thought, you know what, I want to be the change that I want to see, like, you know, so I'm going to try and do something. So that was like the birth of like telling stories through sort of filming them. Yeah, and it was telling, my first sort of documentary I made was a story about a soldier. It's called Black Soldier, White Army, and it's about an amazing radio presenter called Cyrus the Virus, who used to be a presenter on Ujima and BCFM. And it was just telling his story about fighting in Northern Ireland in the Troubles. And at that point in my life, I'd never met a soldier, a black soldier, and hearing his story was just fascinating, and it just made me realise like how many stories that haven't been told, that need to be told in order for there to be a better understanding of how communities think and feel. And his story was one of those stories which was like, wow, that's really powerful, though. It was pretty dark. And then I guess, you know, documentaries is a really good medium to tell stories. But in the last few years, I've sort of looked at drama as sort of a way of telling stories and really creating characters to get across certain things that, you know, messages and things like that I want to get across. So as far as like story is light, I mean, that's what it does. Is, I mean, the impetus for me doing Eight Sense Media was trying to shine a light on unheard stories and untold stories, you know, and try and foster better understanding, because I do really feel, especially film is like, you know, a really good medium to encourage change and understanding. So that's a little bit of a long-winded way of sort of where I got to here, yeah.
Michael, that's perfect. The wind can be long, wide, deep, tall, short, narrow, any which way. It's all good.
It's all good.
Arathi, please.
Yeah, so for a number of years now, I've been researching and writing on themes of settler colonialism, particularly in the Australian context. Perhaps you can hear from my accent, I'm Australian. For those who don't know, Australia, the country that we call Australia, is actually sitting on stolen Indigenous land. Indigenous sovereignty has never been ceded. And yet we don't have a good understanding of this. Those stories of Indigenous survival, resistance and sovereignty have been diminished or denied or distorted in so many of our cultural and media and academic spaces. So that's the work that I've been engaging in at an academic level. But I was really blessed not so long ago, earlier this year, to meet my friend Jasmine Coe, who's sitting in the back, and I promised I wouldn't put her on the spot, but she's waving hi. So Jasmine is a Wurundjeri British artist. Wurundjeri is an Indigenous nation in Australia. She's based here in Bristol, and she's actually establishing the first Aboriginal-owned art gallery in the UK. And so we're collaborating together on really trying to create a space, led by Jasmine, for Aboriginal storytelling in this country. Because I think what's become really clear is that within the UK, within Britain, there's not really a deep sense of what the impact has been of British settler colonialism. And that's not something that is just in the past, it's something that continues to shape everyday life, our political structures, our social structures in Australia, Aboriginal representation and so on, to this day. So we're thinking about British settler colonialism as a really active historical legacy, and it's through Jasmine's storytelling that we are trying to bring this into, get this recognised within the UK context. So I'll stop there. I can talk more perhaps when other things come up. But yeah.
Arathi, thank you. That's very illuminating. Thank you.
really actually lovely to hear your backgrounds. I think this is our first proper encounter as well, so it's actually sort of like really nice to hear about your works, and that already kind of the connections, I think, are like revealing themselves, and our practices. And so for me personally, I think kind of my journey into kind of curatorial work, and especially thinking about kind of centering anti-colonial histories globally, and then what that does to our understanding of history. I think that began to interest me, as many people. I think it was when I went to university a bit later than most people, which it wasn't my kind of plan to begin with. And I remember being in my first year at university and reading Fanon for the very first time. And I remember that feeling viscerally. So I grew up in Cairo. I moved to the UK when I was 8. And I moved to I was the only black kid in my primary school, and then one of a handful in my secondary school. So by the time that I kind of went to uni, when I was 22, I already kind of had some things that were kind of deeply entrenched kind of within me. Things that only reading Fanon for the first time could have really kind of pulled out. For those who aren't familiar with Frantz Fanon, he's a Martinican philosopher, anti-colonial theorist, was operating in the 50s in Algeria, and kind of developed ways of thinking about kind of how racism operates, how racism affects the psyche, but also thinking about how resistance to racism and resistance to colonialism can take place. So he kind of got me, he provided some answers to questions that I didn't even know that I had. And I'm sure, many of us have felt that way when reading, a Malcolm X, or reading a Claudia Jones, or a historian kind of working on that retrieval work, that work that goes against the grain of reading history as you're told to read it. So that was kind of my introduction to that, and then I guess that kind of learning about anti-colonial struggles all across the continent, also learning about my own personal history. I'm Sudanese, of Sudanese origin, and learning about British colonialism in Sudan also helped me gain a better understanding of British history as well, which kind of gave me a sense of agency, gave me a sense that actually my history is fundamental to understanding British history, and so is everyone else's, actually. So that's kind of what led me to this kind of curatorial practice, this practice of thinking about ways to tell, ways to find, I suppose, political and cultural entanglements in a bunch of different things, whether it's paintings, or whether it's family archives, or whether it's objects that have been passed down through your family. I think all of us, no matter what our background is, if we look far back enough, there is an encounter with colonization in one way or another. And I think that, to me, is kind of my focus and my interest, is actually thinking about ways to, I guess, disrupt any monopoly over history, any kind of authority over historical work, and actually saying that everyone is an authority on history. And that's kind of where my approach kind of comes from. Is to say that actually, if by telling your own family history, you are doing that work, actually, that you are doing that disruptive kind of work, where you will be able to find the contradictions in the mainstream history by just looking at your own past. So anyway, so that's how I kind of came to kind of curatorial work, and I'm kind of just currently working on an exhibition called Shifting the Center, where I'm trying to think about ways of telling radical histories that aren't separate from the histories that we're being told, but actually just, problematizes them. So that's the kind of long answer.
Thank you, Orsod. All dimensions are welcomed, so no prefixes required. Everything is welcomed. So having heard a little more expansive introduction to our colleagues, is there anything anybody would like to ask at this point? Remember, we are visually in a circle. That is the ethos of our gathering this evening. So please feel free to engage.
Just for a temperature check, does everyone understand what decolonisation is or means? Does everyone
Nobody understands what decolonisation is.
What's that, Rob?
Nobody understands what decolonisation is.
Okay, that's interesting, Rob.
I think that's really interesting. I think we understand the aim of what we feel we mean when it comes to decolonisation, but I think in terms of the action and actioning it within the current context of our society, I do totally, I don't know the gentleman here, but I do hear some of that in terms of, but what now? Like, we know what the design is, but the implementation is tricky when we're with a plan of attack. If you think about all the systemic restrictions that we're faced with, this I like the narrative of disrupting, but even knowing where to start within that, within all of our different contexts and all the different places that we're coming from. Sorry, I'm theatrical, so I'm trying to project my voice. I work in the theatrical sphere in theatre and drama, and telling stories is really interesting to me, and I think I come against, I also come from education as well, so teaching, and this idea of having this lovely design of what we want decolonisation to be, so we have this very clear outcome. I think if we're people who want to do that work, we know what needs to change, but actually how to make lasting and sustainable changes is I think when the decolonisation thing is tricky, because it's so rooted in like say avenues that both ways, you know, from British culture and then from the colonies, for want of a better expression, really finding where all those avenues are is the first step. This is why it's really interesting to hear from people who are doing that work to shine a light on some of those avenues and some of those stories that we don't know. And then maybe it will enlighten us to find some more solutions.
That's a wonderful contribution.
It's not necessarily a question to the panel. I think it's more picking up on what you said earlier about stories being light, glue and web. I just wondered if you could expand on what you mean by that. I think I know what you might mean, but I'd like to know where you were coming from with that. And I guess I have to introduce myself. So I'm Rosina, and I consider myself a creative, and I think that storytelling can come in so many different forms, and I'm very, very drawn to telling stories that from angles that aren't explored from, through song, through music, through visual, and also through recordings. So I work for a radio station where it's Ujima, which tells a perspective from a Pan-African sense, which you don't see in the social in mainstream media much, and then also environmental work as well, telling the stories about our land. Anyway, but back to the question though, it would be interesting to expand more on what you meant by glue, light and web. Thank you.
Thank you both for your contributions. Being an artist also makes me slightly pedantic, or others might say extremely pedantic. So I just want to challenge one reference that, I'm going to refer to as the theatrical sister, just because you didn't offer us a name.
I'm so sorry, that was me just very awkwardly padding silence, which probably says quite a lot about me. I'm Hannah, I'm working at the Bristol Improv Theatre as their community lead, and so very, very interested in how I can embed some of this insight in the new work that I'm hoping to create there.
Fantastic.
So yeah, that's me.
That's great. So the pedantic point that I wanted to...
what does pedantic mean?
Somebody who's really exacting,
particular and annoying.
So if you give me instructions from here to wherever there is, say, I'll just go down the road a bit and then hang a left, I'm going to say to you, well, how far down the road? And what's the name of that left? And what landmarks am I going to see that tells me I'm headed the right way? So somebody who's really detail focused, some might say obsessed. So that's a bit of pedantic. So my pedantic point with Hannah was maybe already some of these dimensions around the colonial and the legacy of colonialism and the ideology that underpins that, or that the behaviours, the historical behaviours, the contemporary behaviours that are an expression of the colonial is embedded in language. That's how we try to make sense of our experience wherever we're doing that from. So my pedantic point was about your using the term attack. And I'm just wondering if maybe attack is a way of unwittingly continuing to play in a relational dynamic with somebody who's perpetuating a certain orientation, a certain ethos. I'm going to suggest a term from a really interesting American activist called Sean Ginwright, which is to pivot. So by pivoting, we take our attention and our effort and our energy away from the other who is approaching us with a very restrictive or reductive attitude, and look more towards the stories we have of ourselves and that we've engaged in with our ancestral lineages, within our own families, within our own communities. So I just wanted to offer that as an option, as a other possible position to explore. And then in terms, sorry, my memory's not good short term, so please just tell me your name again.
Rosina.
Rosina, thank you. So in terms of this idea of light, glue and web, I'm going to exercise my facilitator's privilege and not answer that myself, because I have three supremely able colleagues here who will, in a popcorn style, if I can encourage that, just make a response as to any one of those, because, you know, that they're so able.
I mean, let me try and tackle story as glue. I think, for me, our mythologies are sort of our glue that hold us together as communities or people. And I feel like, especially sort of with my background being from the Caribbean, a lot of these mythologies are sort of haven't been translated to us here in the UK. But I've seen like mythologies and the way stories have been told through generations, it's really the glue that holds a society together, or a people together. And I feel like a lot of the problems, I mean, this is my personal opinion, but I feel like a lot of the problems we have within the Black Caribbean community specifically is the fact that we've sort of lost these stories, lost these mythologies, and I feel like my mission is to try and revive these mythologies. So we have, because stories are the things that hold people and connect people together on a different realm. That's sort of my view on. That's how I try and tackle stories, glue, I hope that helps.
Yeah. I can offer some reflections on story as web. I think, like a web, we can be enmeshed in a story, we can be positioned by stories, we can position others by stories, but stories can also weave new lines of thinking and feeling, being, right? So I think there's like this is how I'm imagining story as web, something that can enmesh us, but also we can weave ourselves with others.
Nice. That was good.
I think well, story is light. I think we touched on it a little bit, and I think your example was amazing. I think, going to someone in the community and actually see it, and then tracing their past, and then seeing all the the political events that they've been a witness to, and then being able to tell a much larger history through a very personal experience. Yeah. I think that in itself is a really good example of story as light. Story is being able to bring something forward that otherwise wouldn't have been in view or been spotlighted in some way. So I mean that's quite an obvious take on the light one. But I think story, if I could say just a story on web, I think to piggyback off Arathi, I think that this one's a big one for me because story as web is that we are all related to each other in one way or another. That our stories are all interwoven and entangled in one another. There's I think this is a mark of the globalized world, is that actually all of our histories are entangled in one way or another. To give a brief example, I was in Ghana recently, and I'm from East Africa originally, but being in Cape Coast, which is the slave-holding castles, the castles where Europeans held enslaved people before shipping them to the New World, there was a moment really when we think about these places in West Africa, and we think about their relation to Caribbean history for one, but when we also think about the history of South Asian people in the Caribbean, and what the slave trade was, the different geopolitical movements that happened due to the slave trade. But then also thinking about how Sudan can also be read as wrapped up in that whole situation, because without the transatlantic slave trade, the capital needed to go out and colonize the rest of the world, to colonize the rest of the global south, wouldn't have been possible. So in that one place that is actually seen as, Black North American history, or part of Caribbean history, or part of West African history, is also a part of East African history if we're able to make those kinds of connections. And I think that to me, why story as web is so fundamental to me, is that we all mean everything to each other. And I think that is a focus for me. And I would just really like to say that I think we should really contest words like what decolonization means. I think we should, maybe perhaps not today, but I think definitely we need to spend a lot of time talking about what these words mean, because oftentimes they mean various different things to various different people. And I think in order to think about the strands we want to work through, I think it is really important to decide what that means between us. But yeah, thank you.
I think Bob's got a question.
Should I just start, Steve?
Yeah.
Bob, come on. I got two thoughts. I'll mention that. The mic was... Thanks. Hello. Hi. So it's I'm Rob, formerly gentleman in the corner. Hello. And I've got two thoughts. One of them is stories inform how we believe ourselves, how we believe in ourselves, what we believe of ourselves. That's why the response is so powerful. Toy Story is about that, isn't it? It's all about the story you tell yourself how much of a hero or hero you're going to be. So that's one of the aspects I think that we need, probably good to touch on here at some point. But as a filmmaker, artist, like a lot of people in this room, curators, academics, filmmakers, etc., there's a question of resources. And I used to do Black Pyramid many years ago, they're very old, you can see. And back in the mid-90s, there used to be a thing with distributors, Chris Burton will tell you this, that they say Black films didn't make money. That's what they'd say, Black films didn't make money. So there'd be no resources put into them. And these were decisions that were being made by executives, obviously. So audience weren't testing this idea. This was just people, gatekeepers saying, that's not going to happen because they didn't know how to sell it. Classic case of the person who's turned out the Beatles, isn't it, kind of idea. Then Black Panther came along and they got Wakanda Forever, and you may have a few of that because clearly Black films do make money. But when you can put resources in like that, fantastic. But what about us lot? And where do we direct resources? Only limited amount of research papers you can put together, only amount of films, limited amount of films you can make. So, and infrastructure also to me implies how do you reach audiences? Because ultimately that's what having said that, beginning of my point was, the first audience is myself. So regardless of you lot, I could write my own story. My affirmations in the morning, I am amazing, I am amazing, I am amazing, and tell myself a story. So I am the audience for that. But outside of that, infrastructure, again, resources, how do we raise resources, collaborate, share, determine where to direct to find resources, given what the Black Panther budget?
Resources, that's interesting, because that sort of ties into the whole colonisation, decolonisation sort of framework that I guess we're trying to talk about. I mean, resources are scarce, and I think, as artists, as creators, as storytellers...
Sorry, Michael, just because of my pedantry,
yeah.
I'm going to say, in response to your statement that resources are scarce, are they?
That's just a story.
That's true. That's true. That is the story.
Who's
in control of these resources? Yeah.
Story,
that's true.
narrative.
Yeah.
So then we get into the consideration of power and the narratives that enable power, wherever it's concentrated, to sustain itself and suppress other voices, other communities, other narratives, other stories.
Yeah.
But please don't let me interrupt you.
No, that's, I mean, all of that is correct. And when you're talking about power, it's all about us trying to take the power back. I mean, only up until recently, someone like me could literally afford to pick up a camera, have an edit suite on one computer, and be able to actually tell stories. I mean, and that's only something that's happened in the last 10, 15 years, where the equipment's got a lot cheaper and the information is just freely available sort of on places like YouTube. So that's where the power dynamic can shift, where those resources become cheaper, and that enables communities to then have a bit more autonomy over their own story. But you're right, because inevitably who are the ones putting the money into the big Hollywood films, and the ones that are really putting lots of resources into telling specific stories? We don't have any control over that at the moment. Not to say that can't change or won't change, but at the moment, as you said, there's gatekeepers that block that, I think.
Can I add a perspective? So I don't disagree with that, and I think the question about resources and withholding resources, the power that withholds resources, is really important. But I also think that we have to think about storytelling beyond it having outside legitimacy or an outside audience or some sort of storytelling for a market, right? I think storytelling is deeply an intrinsic part of communities. Like the stories we tell in our families aren't things that need to be marketized, but they're so powerful. So you talk about, in terms of your works, you're speaking back to power structures through your stories. And I'm definitely not saying that one shouldn't get paid for that or have the resources available. If that is one's kind of creative industry. But stories as a whole, I think that's what's so powerful about stories, is that nobody can own them. They're ours, right? We can tell them, we can exchange them.
Power is crucial, isn't it? Because we've got 2020 showed us how power is truth, regardless of alternatives. All counter narratives have been squashed since 2020, and the people in power have the affirmation to say what truth is. I think that's interesting. And also, I was brought up within the church, but I think religious stories are very similar. People educate ourselves in math, science, physics, and all sorts, but yet we still believe Bible stories. Now, there is a mystical understanding, of course, but a lot of people don't go for the mystical understanding, they go for the literal understanding. But yet somehow manage to reconcile that with the physical impossibility of certain things. Not to say that there isn't a truth in it. I think there is a truth in it, but it's a mystical one. However, the power that asserting that story into me is what's done that. So therefore I can go to work in a physics department and still believe in the virgin birth or whatever. That's power. It's a good point of power.
Thanks, Rob.
So we're getting into, it seems, something of the issue of light. We have in our language the idiom of, That was really enlightening. That was really illuminating. Oh, you shone a light on that so well. So we have a sense of light being the process by which narratives or stories that have been hidden or suppressed or marginalized or overshadowed actually have an opportunity to be told and, importantly, to be heard. And as Arathi almost inferred, I guess, there's a certain kind of currency which isn't a monetary currency, but is a cultural currency in the value of storytelling and recognizing that those stories have an intrinsic value before there's a sense of a marketplace. We don't, I imagine, for the most part, trade stories within our families or within our social networks and expect some kind of financial recompense. It's a form of connecting with our family members, with our extended family and with our communities, which brings us into the realm, so to speak, of glue. So I wonder if that might be something we could touch on some more.
I actually would love to hear more about Arathi's work on this, because I would say, you know, taking it one step further of what you're saying, Stuart, I actually think this idea of glue is also, I mean storytelling is necessary for survival. I think it's necessary for the survival of memory, for the understanding of who you are in the world, how to place yourself in the world, how to understand yourself in relation to the world around you, your lived environment, you know, whether that be natural or whether that be, you know, an urban environment. You know, you have to. This is, I think, the thing that really draws me to this kind of work, which is my question is coming. But I think this idea of memory is fundamental, and I think that, you know, a lot of the work tends to be this kind of retrieving, you know, of things of you know, saying, oh, actually, you know what? No, there were black people in World War II. And then being like, oh, okay, well, let's include that in the mainstream. And people, you know, everyone already knows that this is a fact. Everyone, you know, we have grandparents, we have people who have been involved in these but then we wait for the mainstream to tell us, actually, yes, you're absolutely right. We'll dot some around in this next film, this next blockbuster film. But, you know, Europe is still the winner, still the hero. And then, you know, we have kind of. There's, I guess, like that relationship with the mainstream where we're, you know, screaming things at them and then they finally kind of take it in and absorb it. But then there's also kind of actually the as you're saying, Arathi, the conversations that we exchange with our families, you know, the actual understanding, well, where's my grandparent from? What relationship do I have with this distant land that I can't speak the language, or which I can't speak the language of? And I think that, especially for diasporic communities, I think for indigenous communities all around the world, I think it's a way of maintaining a relationship to yourself and to the people around you. And this is why I think storytelling is more than just, I suppose, something that is I suppose, some kind of hobby is the wrong word, but it's a sort of interest. But I think it's actually about relating to living. It's about being alive, you know. And I would love to hear more about your work, Arathi, on that area, because we talk about epistemicide and these kinds of issues, and I would love to hear more on that if that's okay, Stuart.
I'm not the referee.
Sure. I think that those are such powerful words. The idea is that, you know, storytelling and memory making is the stuff of life itself, right? You know, and I want to link what you've said to something that, Stuart, you mentioned about, okay, stories are told, but how are they heard, and are they heard at all? And that's a question that we, as in the project that I've been working on with Jasmine and another colleague of ours, Amy, we've been thinking about, because, of course, Indigenous people have been telling stories always, right? Those stories have always existed and passed, and often not for the not for the ears of non-Indigenous people like myself, because that's not the purpose of those stories. Those stories are for family and for those who belong to particular nations. And so it's also, I think it's really important to understand what the purpose of storytelling is, and in that sense that it is glue, but it doesn't necessarily have to be glue, or it doesn't glue us all together necessarily, right? And I think that's really an important thing to think about. For our work, we're thinking how, in the context of the UK, and as mostly, the audiences who would come, the participants who would come to an art gallery to view Aboriginal art, Australian Aboriginal art, they're most likely going to be non-Aboriginal people. So the question is, how do they listen to those stories? And so the stories are being told as they always have been. Those are not necessarily knowledges that have been destroyed. They are living, just as Indigenous sovereignty and Indigenous cultures are living. So the question is, why do we keep blocking our ears, right? And that is the tension, that's the challenge that we're going to have in this project, because we've talked about the importance of deep listening, about what the ethics and care of listening might involve, and we're hoping, so the project is in its infancy, but as we move on with it, we're hoping that we're going to work out what this looks like in practice. What would it mean for us to come into that space, to an Aboriginal space, and listen to those stories and think, how does this shift my understanding of myself, my understanding of British history, and so on. And I think, so part of storytelling is also listening. That's where
I'd just like to add on to what you're saying about our stories being like our sense of memory, because I truly resonate with that, because I feel like as I understood more about my heritage and the heritage of, as I've understood more about my heritage and the heritage of the world, in terms of not looking at it as his story but as our story, it's made me regain more sense of myself and in a sense gain more sense of my memory, and I feel like it relates to your own personal life. Like if you was to forget parts of your own story that you've lived through, then you'd forget parts of your sense of yourself, because the experiences that we go through shape how we are, and so yeah.
So, David, something at the front.
Is it okay to respond?
Sorry, I'm very over my own voice, but I'm just, I'm so sorry, I don't know the person. Your point about stories giving you a sense of connection to your identity. I guess what I want to then touch on, this might be very, very personal perspective, but I often find that when we're talking about this very specific lens of the work, that there's an assumption that the people who are creating the work, the people who are listening to the stories, the audience, are already part of that community or part of the wider sense of belonging. And I think that when, obviously from a personal reason, I'm mixed race, my stories do not match either side of my family, and there's only so much I can do about that. And I do often wonder about this disconnect between generational stories and the pace of change with newer generations. I'm not that young, but I am in one generation. I've seen how different my story can be from the people who raised me, the people who are in my lives, in that sense. So in terms of stories being part of connection to your own identity, connection to your community, I just wondered what the perspective was from the table, the circle, about people who don't automatically belong. So within intersectionality, it's about being very, very aware that actually one person's story within that wider community isn't always going to latch into, especially when you're talking about, it's really interesting about this curation of history, these lines of, and I'm so interested about mythology, I'm obsessed with mythology as well, and I'm very, very keen. But again, when you come down the lines of generation, there's this weird bottleneck that's going to happen where you start to address where are these younger voices, where do they belong in that? And I don't know the answer, so that's why I'm opening that up.
Could I just add on quickly? Also, when just talking about like stories being a sense of my identity, like when discovering like history or our story, it's more in the sense of less like, say, Nigerian heritage and Jamaican heritage and French heritage, but it's less about me discovering like a certain like through my certain like culture, which is one thing, but also seeing the bigger picture and seeing how all the stories interlink, because they do always interlink, and we're all on this like earth together. So when something's happening on one side of the earth and the culture's existing, it's pretty much probably related to another culture on the other side of the earth in terms of its spirituality, in terms of like clothing, many things, and it all does connect back. And I feel like when looking at it through that way, then we start to regain a sense of like our true connectivity and really strip it back away from the layers of like black and white and this and that. So yeah.
These are some really welcomed and heartening and encouraging responses, and I know that also particularly, and maybe my other colleagues as well, want to respond, but I just want to try and tease out a couple of the threads that have come up. So one of the terms that came up and has come up several times is a notion of the mainstream. Another distinction that I think I heard was this idea of heroics and heroism, and how perhaps that has a very particular cultural context where that idea has resonance, where that idea has standing, or that idea has power. Another theme that I think was expressed was around connection and meaning within diasporic and indigenous communities. So, of course, within a diaspora, people are geographically and very literally dispersed. So how then do we make sense, or how then does such a community make sense of its experience, both its relationship to its history, its relationship to migration, and its relationship to settling and, by whatever degree, enculturation or assimilation in its new-found place or places. So one of the connective threads seems very much about stories. Stories, because one of the themes that came up a little after that was the notion of living cultures, of dynamic cultures that have a relationship to the present, to the past, and to the future, which, without our going into it immediately, for me personally seems very resonant with the idea of an UnMuseum. And I'll just unpack that notion a little bit. When we think of museums, or when I think of museums, for the most part, I'm thinking of an institution and a building and a place of authority which has a very Eurocentric perspective. It's the world through the lens of European eyes, and therefore it's the world through the lens of European ideology. And we know that a big part of Northern European ideology has been expressed through the projects of empire and colonization, which diminishes other peoples, other cultures, other histories, other stories, other narratives. So there's already some kind of asymmetric representation of reality through those particular stories, that particular lens. And then something came up about cosmologies and epistemologies, and I'm going to try and say those things very simply, because one of the challenges when we're exploring these ideas around culture, around decolonization or anti-coloniality or Afro-futurities or black futurities is the language can start to get a bit technical and a bit jargony. It's not the everyday corner shop, your favourite coffee shop exchange as you're waiting for your brew. So when we think about cosmologies, we're talking about what is the conceptual idea any community or any group of people have about what makes the world the world. What is our relationship to these other beings in the world, these other bodies in the world, whether they're planetary bodies or celestial bodies. How do we make sense of that? And partly how we make sense of that is, of course, through stories, whether they're mythologies or whether they're legends. They're all forms of stories. And then when we think about epistemology, it's more a question of how do we rationalize these experiences? What's the framework of ideas and of knowledge that enables us individually to make sense and then collectively to communicate that sense making? Because it's not already out there, all of this is, so to speak, in here. And when we talk about making sense, maybe we're trying out our story with somebody else to see if it resonates with their experience, and that's what begins to connect us. So that may have been a slight tangent, and I know Orsod did have a very particular response that he wanted to make. So.
All right. Does anyone? Did you have? No. I wanted to make sure. Sorry, your name has slipped my mind. Hannah. Yeah. Your point about being mixed heritage, and you were saying that those they didn't quite match. Could you say a bit more what you meant by that?
Yeah. So I'm mixed race. I'm from Jewish and Caribbean heritage, and I have personally no link to my Caribbean heritage. So in terms of that line of story, it ended. So I have no access to that on a personal level. I can absolutely do some research, but it's like I'm researching my direct heritage from an outside point of view, from trying to get into a community that I don't have a key to a door. I'm welcome, sometimes, but that I don't have that direct link at all. And then being with mixed race heritage in a Jewish community when I'm not religious, it was very sorry. I'm so sorry. I'm so over my own voice already. I'm so sorry, everybody. Just essentially those stories filter down, and I welcome them. And I was very, very fortunate. I had a mum who was incredibly active, realising, she wasn't one of these like, whoops, I have a brown child, what am I going to do? She knew. She really hammered home, introduced me to, and mythology was often a way into some of that Caribbean culture. So she read Arathi to me, we did all of that. That was great. Sweet Honey in the Rock concerts, we were there. It's great. But again, it's passed through, again, that Eurocentric lens. It was the access that my white mother had to that Caribbean culture that she could then give to her brown child in this second-hand way. And then again, I'm very interested with this idea of generational. It's something that I feel is so important, especially within sort of indigenous communities, and in that beautiful kind of passing on of historic storytelling that happens through that word of mouth, through that very family unit. But again, if you look at modern families, often that way of working in terms of how you pass through and how you curate those stories is assuming you're coming from a very, heteronormative sense of how we create a family, and also assuming that procreation is part of that. And I often think about, again, if we're going to make it personal, I've decided that I don't want children, but I often think, but does that mean that my stories end? Do my stories end? I have no brothers and sisters. I have no children. So generationally, does my family line just end? And yes, we live in modern technology, so we can record some stuff and I can write some stuff, and I might be motivated to do so. But I think going back to the point that was made earlier about how do we create work, put it into a place where people are listening, and how are they listening, especially in this country. And let's be very honest, when you're creating film, museums, galleries, theatre work, the majority of people in this country that access those types of events, activities, are going to more often than not be white people of a certain economical access. I've been a performer most of my life. I was a theatre actress for many years, and I remember looking out, and we would play "Where's the Brown People?" Oh my goodness! And I was in stories that were written for brown people. I was in stories playing characters that were about the Black or Afro-Caribbean experience. I was in those stories, and I'm still looking out, going, how are we getting those people to address? So I think it's about marrying up. Yes, and I totally agree. It's not always about this needing to be marketable and it needing to make money. But I do think it's important to think about, if we are not in a position to pass on those stories in a direct line, then how do we get it out into the media in a way that is then sustainable and sustained and then listened to, and who is listening to, and how do we create things that's, I'm so sorry, but this project that you're explaining is one of the first times I've ever spoken to a creative who is making something that isn't necessarily for the British audience. That isn't part of the creation. At no point did you say, we're thinking about how Bristol will respond to this work. That's the first time I've ever been in an environment where creative people are not thinking about, well, how do you make money in this theatre, and how do white people essentially access this, and who's going to buy these tickets, and even if we want to get black and brown people and Asian people in through the door, that's an extra budgeting thing. That's an extra thing you have to think about. How do we get these groups of people that this story is for them? How do we get them in? So I've gone on a massive tangent, but that's kind of where I'm at with where do the stories end, and how do we get it's twofold for me. Sometimes those stories will end, and sometimes it's about thinking about who we're bringing in. I think it's important to think about the audience in this country, and
Do you want to respond? I have a comment.
Oh, he's like you read my mind, did I? I was going to say, never mind. But no, I didn't know what I wanted to say, but I think what you were saying, I just want to say thank you so much for sharing what you said about the mixed race story, because that is something that's not shared a lot, and very recently it's just really hit me, the reality of being mixed race and between two worlds, and having all these projections and expectations when I'm also seeking guidance and things, and it's just, so we need to talk later. But I also want to say that I'm really glad that you also touched on that point of, okay, whose stories are we telling, but who is hearing those stories, and how are we engaging people in these stories, and who. And it's really great to hear about your project as well. I can't remember your name. Arathi. And I just also want to say that I'm actually doing a project. So I said earlier I do environmental work, and I've come from the Black and Green Ambassador programme. A lot of people won't know what that is, but it's about engaging black and brown people in the environmental movement, but not only giving them a seat at the table, giving them a seat at their own table, and thinking, okay, how are we going to make this movement more representative and inclusive, and find the stories that are untold, that have been there for things that black people are leading in and have been leading in from the beginning, and what they're doing now. And so where are you sharing those stories? How are you doing it in a way that's engaging and accessible, instead of just absorbing a specimen and then using jargon and putting it in an academic paper and talking about someone, and not, So I just want to reassure you there are lots of projects out there that are doing it for a different audience and much needed as well. But yeah, I just wanted to share that, and I just loved everything you brought up, so thank you. Yeah.
Just to respond to both, actually, I think this kind of idea that one is breaking this kind of monopoly over who gets to tell histories, who's the authority on specific kinds of histories, and I think that just in this discussion, I think that you kind of demonstrated this point that actually who can kind of author a particular history about a very specific experience, which is your own experience, and how that kind of links up to everything else is you, right? So it doesn't. So I think that even in your retelling, your very brief retelling of your own personal history, we're able to kind of touch on several different nodes that at some point, there may be someone with similar kind of historical trajectory that will look at your story and be like, oh wow, okay, like I wasn't the only one. There was actually someone else, living here who had, a very similar kind of experience to what I'm experiencing. And I think that that's the more kind of personal element, I think, of these histories. The other thing, when we talk about identities, I think that we have to be very careful, I think, especially in this kind of climate, when we're thinking about, how much our identities kind of lead the way by way of our storytellings, whether we're white, black, whatever. And I think that because we need to kind of operate from the understanding that actually identity is really unstable. There is actually no, there is no, black is not black and white is not white, and actually it's a total oversimplification actually of how complex our lived realities are. And I think that that's a point that we really need to carry into kind of work more generally, is that actually, yes, it is very, very important that people who are, overrepresented in negative ways need to be represented in more complex ways, in ways that are more kind of interesting, that actually mimic the reality of our situations. I think that's fundamental, that needs to happen. But I think that, thinking about identity as not necessarily fixed, but actually as this very complicated, very fluid kind of, categories actually helps us insert ourselves into particular movements at particular times, right? So if for instance, for me, I'm Sudanese. When I moved to this country, I didn't recognize myself as black. I was Sudanese first, I was African, and when I arrived here, I became black. Yeah. Right, so that's the relationship. In Sudan and in Africa, I'm not considered a black person, but when I'm walking around Surrey, when I'm walking around here, I'm considered black. And this is what I mean about the fluidity of identities. If we're South Asian, or if we're East Asian, and we're from a particular country, we're going to be recognized by our particular ethnicities, which are so varied that Europeans don't even have the language to begin to categorize us in those terms. Right, so I think that that's just something to bear in mind. I think that whatever complexities that you're coming with, actually, it's really important that you stay true to the open-endedness of that. And not thinking, okay, well, how do I just? Where's the black in me, and where's the Jewish in me, and where's maybe I just need to separate these things in a way. But actually, the importance, the story that you have to tell is that it is complicated, and that's fundamental. Right? What would your thoughts? Sorry.
I'm just blown away. Yeah, brilliant. And actually, as you were talking about the limitations of thinking about identity in a fixed way because it is complicated, because it's unstable, this also gets me thinking about how stories and storytelling is so powerful because it's the telling of humanity, not necessarily identity, right? So if it gives us, stories give us access to shared symbols, shared, possibilities to recognize our experiences in someone else's experience. I mean, that's why we read books, presumably, that's why we go to the theatre, and so I think that that's so powerful that, yes, we might see that we have, certain identities within us, but actually, fundamentally, there is a humanity here that we are trying to tell in our stories, and hopefully trying to listen in other people's stories.
Yeah, absolutely.
I know I'm like you. I'm sick of my voice, but I just wanted to kind of touch on just sort of what you said, I'm really bad with names.
Orsod, yes.
Orsod.
Yeah.
About this embracing the fluidity and how, do I need a mic? No, I don't. Can people hear me?
Yeah.
Embracing the fluidity and sort of about resting in that and allowing, you know, you don't need to be, oh, which part needs black, which part needs. I think that's definitely an empowering space to get to in terms of just it's embracing the truth of what's fluidity and breaking away from this very rigid way of looking. But within doing that, you've got to always put up a conscious resistance to the system you're in, where that always, because for centuries what I'm trying to say, for centuries the societies we live in have always tried to put things in boxes, and they're constantly projecting that onto you. And when you're in between those boxes, it's about having to kind of have that resilience and that reminder and that taking that time with yourself to try and resist that. And while you're resisting it, trying to tell those stories of how it doesn't have to be that way to people. And one point I forgot to touch on when you said about how you like seeing projects that are telling stories to people other than the European mainstream eye. With regards to the project I'm doing, it's about engaging black and brown people, but also it's about telling the stories to the people who are in powerful positions, who tend to be white and middle class people, but in a way that they might not necessarily want to hear it. So it's about so it's just, I just thought that was an interesting point. I also want to say that I've got Jewish heritage and Jamaican and Egyptian and Rasta, but so it's just, it's just already I'm seeing all these stories that actually connect us all already. I just wanted to make a point about that. It's,
I wonder if you
Can I
have...
add to what... Oh, sorry. I didn't mean to interject.
No, go on. No.
I was going to ask...
The whole point is
Sorry?
to interject. You are invited very warmly to do so.
Thank you. Yeah, Rosina, what you were saying about that conscious resistance, and just the whole notion of stories in general, a lot of these stories have been stories we've been conditioned to believe about ourselves, even from our own parents, you know, and even from the way we've been treated by the communities we were raised in, the cultures we're exposed to, you know, the external society and internalized racism, and not enoughness, not feeling enough, and a lot of this is like breaking down to the essence of who we are, you know, the soul, just who we are as a person. Thank you. I don't know if I need a mic. And once we
for the recording.
Thank you. And once we do that, I think, yeah, you strip it there to the core, you know, the core essence of just your beingness, and then that connects you all, and then you make peace with yourself as you get older. Like you said, it's a never-ending journey. You're making peace with yourself as you grow and evolve as a person, you know, and with stories as well. There should not, I mean, it gets to that point of resistance where you don't need a certain reaction from people or a certain outcome or for it to have monetary gains. It's just for the pure fact of just sharing and self-expression, just expressing yourself, especially after years of being suppressed and repressed. That's what's truly liberating. So it's getting to that point of, yeah, just like connecting to who you are and making peace with that, and yeah, just building that awareness and just expressing yourself as you keep going and going through life. So yeah, I mean, that's the journey that I've been on. It's complicated as well with identity as well. I mean, yeah, it's a never-ending journey, but yeah. There's so much more I can say, but I talk a lot as well. I'm very into details as well. And you explain like, oh, you have to go this way, blah, blah, blah. So I love the detail. Thank you.
I think there's a thank you for your contribution as a person just behind. Thank you.
Greetings everyone, apologies for my lateness. My question is also about story retrieval. So, what do you do? Give me an example. You're going to archives, engaging with archives, and the way that history is even handled is not with care, essentially. And yeah, you're just in that space. So you're trying to obviously create those stories from what's already there. Yes, it's open access, but in terms of the ethical, like point of care and even interpretation. Yeah, I don't know if that's a question that you can talk to or answer.
What's your point?
As a member of the circle, what's your point about it? Sorry.
I find it difficult, and I think that's where I come from a standpoint of is important, mental health and self-care, but at the same time these stories are really important. So how do we do it, or get our armour, so to speak, to get those stories out? Because a lot of the time when you go into these archives, it's a bit like ripping off a bandage and creating a wound which is not even healed yet. And you have to, like, you don't have to sit there because I walk out, but you have to deal with that. And it's like, oh, I need to get to this, but without you essentially, but then you're the gatekeeper. So how do we do this work, but, you know, with the right armour? Spiritually, mentally, physically, do you know what I mean?
That's a good question.
That's a really good question.
You raised some very interesting and some very resonant perspectives, and I'm going to encourage a go-round from my colleagues, and then I'm going to suggest that we, to use a term I used a little earlier, just pivot the focus of the remaining time that we have together and see if we can create a story, or what your envisioned stories are, of what then might an UnMuseum constitute if it's going to be an enabler of a space of care and a space of attention and a space of curiosity and a space of connection. What might that feel like? What might that look like? How might we physically engage with a literal physical place, but also a virtual place? So we can come to that, but maybe you might want to just initially address this notion of care and self-care, as well as care towards histories and stories that may have been carelessly recorded or carelessly archived for historical reasons.
Boy, I think that's a really good question, because, you know, yes, going into archives can really open up wounds. I think it just, I don't know. I don't really know how to answer that, because for me, I'm fascinated of sort of trying to find the truth or trying to dig deep. So, I mean, understanding, you know, how colonialization and the enslavement of my ancestors worked, I know that there's going to be some wounds that there's going to be some things that I'm going to come across that are going to be uncomfortable. But I don't know, I feel like I learned a lot about my history when I was really young, and I sort of had that stage of like finding out certain things and then sort of like rebelling against the world. So I don't know, I went through that at a younger stage, so now when I go to an archive, I can like separate sort of my emotion from, especially when you're making documentaries, you have to have some sort of a separation from the emotion, just so you can get to what the facts are, what the tangible facts are. Because for me, that's what I want. I want to expose these truths. So there's history that we don't know about, and I'm all interested in exposing it. So, and as far as how do I deal with self-care after that, I think I listen to music. I think music is what calms me down or takes me to a different space. But when you're telling stories, especially me as a writer, and you're getting into people's heads and characters, you have to learn how to separate yourself emotionally, otherwise it will be all consuming. And I think that is what people need to understand when they're learning, you know, sensitive histories about their own culture. You have to be ready to take that really, and figure out a way of like self-care afterwards, so that you have a bit of a separation, because a lot of our stories are traumatic, you know, and that's a reason why a lot of our elders didn't necessarily share them, because of that trauma.
Yeah, thank you, Michael. I mean, just to build on that, I think one of the images we have of someone who goes into an archive as a solitary thinker, a solitary reader of those archives. But I suppose one of the ways we could think about self-care is to actually engage with that work in community, to make sure that the things that you're reading, the violence that you're coming across in those archives are ones that you're able to share with others, to work through together with others, I think, just as a kind of perhaps a strategy of self-care. But I also wonder if it's about, I often think about how do we even define an archive. Those state archives are by definition ones that are violent because they're formed through colonial erasure, right? Only certain stories are contained in those. So how do we, expand what we think of as an archive, the kind of oral history work, thinking about what other sources you might draw upon to do that work that you're doing, but also reading the silences and reading against the grain within the archives is also a reminder that where things are omitted, right, where there is the silences or the erasures, rather, in the archives, that also spells resistance and survival. And I think it's, if you can find any space for feeling, working against the kind of the violence that the archives represent, is that actually, in its silences, there has always been resistance and survival. So it's about just reminding yourself of that when you're coming across those violences.
I really agree, and I think it's a really great question. I think archival work is, I guess, something that I'm really focused on, and there is that kind of the solitary experience. There's the kind of booking an appointment. There's the things that you can't touch, the things that you can, the things that are by appointment. The thing, So I think just the institution. If we're thinking about archive as the institution that you're going into. That's its own relationship, but if we're thinking about archiving as going back and looking into your family albums, I mean that's also a form of kind of looking back at the past, at precious materials that have been passed down through generations, and that is in itself also a part of archiving, and a part of the practice of archiving. But I would say that in I think when we think about memory and we think about archival work, I think that there is an understanding. We have to kind of, I suppose, adopt an understanding of memory as this site of struggle, right? So memory as this kind of that we're always being told what to remember. Every single day we're being told what to remember. We're being told to remember Russia's wars in Ukraine, but don't look at Israel's wars in Palestine. Really just make sure that you remember the crimes of the Soviet Union, but no, absolutely don't remember the crimes of the British Empire. I think that there is a we are constantly every single day being told what to remember and what to forget. And I think that the beautiful thing about archiving work is that it gives you kind of an opportunity to kind of to look at the past, look at the materials from the past, and commune with it, commune from these people, these people that have recorded their stories, commune with people who have resisted violence, commune with the people who have tried to fight for a better world and actually left the world in a better place than they found it in. And I think at the moment I'm doing a project on the Grenadian Revolution, and if no one has had a chance to look into that, I really, really, really recommend that you do. And that's the Grenadian Revolution from 1979 to 1983. I won't say a whole bunch about it, but I think even in that sense there are a lot of I'm at pains every time I do that, especially with kind of anti-colonial work, because there are dreams in that work. There are unfulfilled people's dreams of building up their communities and building up their societies to be better, to be self-determining, to be to I guess create a world that's more equitable. Whether we're thinking about the Black Panther Party in the US, or whether we're thinking about freedom fighters in Angola and you know, in African countries during those moments of decolonization. I think that reading those histories is difficult because it's really upsetting, because you think about the dreams deferred. You think about, oh, you know, that freedom, you know, something amazing was happening and then it didn't quite come to fruition, you know? And then I think in that in itself is quite upsetting. But then there is kind of the thing, I suppose, the only thing I can talk about with self-care and this, you know, what, you know, or like trying to kind of, I guess, like see to my wounds when you're looking through this work. I can only talk about it personally. And for me, it's kind of this understanding that actually the work is ongoing, right? That this isn't a piece of historical material, a dead artifact that I'm looking at. It's actually a message. It's a picking up the baton, you know? Like this is a thing that's been placed before you with almost like a blueprint that, you know, we must kind of be in dialogue with and try and pick up and try and run with in some kind of way. You know, so when you're reading, you know, Malcolm X's speeches, or when you're, you know, thinking about, you know, all of the, you know, different freedom fighters from all over the world, I think that the idea is to, I suppose, try and think about ways that this can, you know, one, retrieve memory, retrieve kind of this idea of political agency, and then thinking about what can be done to continue this struggle for kind of memory, if that makes sense, right? So, yeah, but sorry, I feel like that went on for ages, but please take the mic from me. Thank you.
Thank you.
Host, is that all right?
Excuse me?
If I may.
Sorry, can you repeat what you said?
If I can interject.
Yes.
Please do.
Cool. What should the UnMuseum look like or be? I think there's light touch, indigenous knowledge that should be appealing to those who are yet to engage with it. It's an appetizer. And then there should be, I think there should be like different levels of consciousness, because not everyone wants the deep stuff. Not everyone wants the light stuff. And some people want, you know, to get the middle, and then it will take them a lifetime to go into the super conscious, right? Because unless the person who is engaging is going to convert the learned knowledge and then actually implement this indigenous knowledge that they are coming across, then it is still consumerism of an idea of something, okay? They light touch things. For example, you know, this Western philosophy that women go first, and African philosophies that men goes first to protect you. So it's not being rude, it's to protect. So the man goes first. So if you take on a practice like that, that's step one, right? You have some where you are looking at those in terms of your lineage. You know, you have totems. How do you embrace your totem? And especially where you have issues of mental health and suicide in African philosophy and theology. Those things is where there are people within your heritage that are trying to communicate through you because of their unutilized innate abilities, but now they're trying to give you a message. And where you may not hear that message, there could be elements of mental health. But when we do hear that calling, there could be elements of additional strength. You know, you kind of see these in Japanese movies, and you've seen them in Black Panther. These things are there, but unless people that are wanting to engage with this heritage are going to make it practical, then we are just consumers. But my main example was, I remember I was working, and my father's friend came to pick him up in South Africa. This guy came out of a Jaguar. This is 15 years ago. And when he came out, he was wearing his traditional attire, right? I said, why, your dad just goes to work like that? He said, yeah, because he's now at a point where he can actually feel comfortable in being who he is at every single point in time. It was not a dress-up event, but that's what he was dressed up in every single day, you know, to kind of show his culture wherever he is. So I think we have to be conscious of those that want to engage and to what extent they're going to take this information to make radical changes. Additionally, there's the element of media and content creating, right? We can create educational resources, but they'll end up on page 12 of Google, okay? So, although there could be a lot of schemes of work or cultural relevant content, it is also more about how then do we use it, how then do we promote it, because you are then the agent of change, right? How are you sharing that content when you come across it? Are you or are you not? Are you promoting it? Are you commenting? All of those things will help to fight the digital war of these great films that are being produced, not actually surfacing when you want to show something to your child or something at school. It's a digital war, you know? How are you actually engaging on that on the everyday basis? So I think we have a mixture of audiences. Some want the lifestyle. Some want the thoughts and just, fantasize about it. Some want the practical, let me change it myself. My last point is, in South Africa, we can see communities that have decided to act as a unit and have actually created their own villages. And in those villages, they are creating the norm in which they choose to live. So these things are not impractical. They are very practical if there's a unit that's going to act as a unit and move forward. Thank you.
Sounds good.
Our mic is working. It's good.
It's totally
So we've had some very rich, very incisive and very stimulating contributions from our circle here this evening. We have a little more time remaining available to us. So I think I'm going to invite my colleagues to each offer their view, their perspective on what this physical space and this virtual space, this experiential space might look like, feel like, sound like. And before they do that, I again want to just pick up on something that came from one of the earlier responses in the circle, which was the question of how to get people in through the door to the physical space where work of a particular orientation was happening. And I'd just like to flip that on its head and ask the question, how best to take that work out of the door and in to the community or the communities at large? What are the more accessible, to them attractive, compelling, practical channels or media through which the ideas or the work or the stories may be better engaged with? So I don't think there's a fixed idea about what that may look like, but it's just a different way of considering how that engagement can take place. So, popcorn style, whoever feels they have an appetite.
I'll make a start. So, the UnMuseum, as I'm imagining this, I think, could it be a space that is grounded in a principle of epistemic reparation? So epistemic is just a fancy word for knowledge. So how do we make reparations for the knowledge that has been diminished, ignored, distorted, silenced through the colonial project? And could this UnMuseum act as a space for reparations, the reparations of knowledge? And to tie it back to the theme of tonight, I think this is where storytelling is so powerful. And we talked earlier about storytelling as healing. So healing, repair, reparation, I think these are connected ideas that could be a principle, a guiding principle of this UnMuseum. What it would look like and feel like to walk into such spaces or engage with it in a virtual sense. I think this is, I wonder if some of the ideas that we've talked about tonight, connection, reciprocity, relationality, and ethics of care when we're listening, I wonder if these could be fleshed out as the stuff of what it means to participate in an UnMuseum.
Thank you, Arathi.
That museum. It's a strange one, that one. That museum. I mean, for me, just going back to my other point about sort of mythologies. I mean, for me, I like to take responsibility or be the change that I want to see. So for me, how I would approach this is by creating content that can speak to a wide audience, but infuse, mythology, infuse our stories into it. I think that's the, storytelling through the medium of film, for me, is one of the most powerful ways of sort of getting across messages or changing people's perception on things and making people look at things from a different angle. So personally, that's sort of where I want to see more sort of change, more of our stories being told through all different genres as well, not just crime thrillers. So that's sort of, and then within this space, whatever this space might be, whether it's virtual or physical space, being able to disseminate those stories, having a place to distribute stories, having a place to access audiences, that's, what I see the museum possibly being a place for audiences to go to then learn about the other side of the history that they're not taught in the mainstream. I think that is, and I guess that's what the UnMuseum would be. It would be the opposite to what you'd see in a museum. It would be the untold, the hidden stories that are not expressed. I think that's what it feels like it means to me. Yeah.
I mean, yeah, it is that, reparative work. It's that restorative work. It's also the kind of the making visible what has been invisible for a very long time, silenced or made kind of put out of reach of kind of the casual readers of history. It's. But I think in terms of the UnMuseum, it's a tough question. It's a tough question. I think, I think that there's sometimes, I suppose, need to be careful in our kind of attempts to create something that serves a similar purpose as an institution that already exists, for it not to replicate it in practice. Just by having a name that's separate, or a name that's, conveys that it's the antithesis, or like the thing that goes against that institution, isn't enough. And I think that's what's so wonderful about actually all the conversations we had over the summer, like this conversation today, because I think it comes down to a question of practice, right? It comes down to a question of how then, if we understand archiving as actually, or the museum, the existence of the museum coming from a kind of a colonial legacy, it's these big structures that showed you all the wonderful things we've gotten from the colonies and puts them on display, all these wonderful stolen artifacts, or, the practice of archiving itself, which is important to museum work, which is, recordings and taking things and making them pieces of story, that we can, put together in some kind of way. I think for the UnMuseum, I think the biggest task is to think about practice, is to think about what does a reparative, restorative kind of historical work look like, and then be a site where that work can take place and people can be involved in that work and dialogues to take place. I think that, and it not just be a place for, artifacts, but also a place for, I suppose, for poetry, for the arts, for things that are often kind of deemed, actually, they're not for you. It's going back to that audience question, the idea that, okay, well, we do all of this stuff, but only white people ever show up, or only people of a certain class ever show up to this stuff. And I think that these are all questions that I think we need to keep in mind. I think about like how then do we attract the the largest group of people that we can in a way that demonstrates our kind of interconnectedness with one another. And I think, yeah, so ultimately I think with the UnMuseum, I imagine a place where, you know, everyone is able to occupy a position where they can tell their histories in a way that connects with everyone else's. And I think that's really fundamental, because I think that sometimes, last thing I'll say about it is that I often think that when we exclude certain people, so if we're saying, you know, we want a museum that focuses on Black history, or we want a museum that focuses on, you know, Asian history, or we want a museum that focuses on, you know, the history of people of color. I think oftentimes what we end up doing is segregating our histories and our knowledges, you know, and actually separating them from white people. And I'm just going to riff off this for a moment, because actually I think that there is a total lack of historical understanding on that side of things. And I think that it's fundamental for all of us to understand that there is no Europe without the Third World, that there is no Europe without kind of the contributions that we have made. There is no, you know, understanding World War I and World War II and its kind of colonial backgrounds, understanding the history of Australia, understanding the labour movements in those countries. I think that these are all fundamental, really, to actually understanding, getting a bit of a better understanding of the world around us. So anyway, so I would say, to end, the UnMuseum is a place where kind of we can really think about redeveloping practice, a practice that's restorative, and finally a place that kind of demonstrates our interconnectedness, our kind of being everything to each other, I think. Yes.
Thank you to my colleagues, and thank you to everybody who has joined us this evening. And I would encourage you to show your appreciation for my colleagues Arathi Sriprakash, Michael Jenkins, and Orsod Malik.